the donut conversation, I was concerned that Kiara was going for the donuts. I was like, no, that's not a good idea. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. The speaker works in the nursery. Good. All right. So, I have to admit that I'm not thrilled about this sermon, and I've been struggling kind of all week with it because in a lot of ways I think it can kind of devolve into just being maybe simple morality in some ways, and that's not really, that tends to not be Jesus. Jesus tends to be much more complicated than just simply do this and everything will work out. Do this, and you're not doing the right thing. So stay with me here. Because as I read through the story about Mary and Martha, the first reading, it seems like Jesus is kind of throwing practical, hardworking women under the bus. I mean, Jesus has told his disciples earlier, okay, that they, to go out in ministry and to rely on housing and hospitality of strangers. And Martha is doing this, right? Mary's not the owner of the house. Martha is the owner of the house. And she invites Jesus and his disciples in for dinner. How many of us right now at your house are ready and prepared for 13 unannounced dinner guests tonight? Anybody? I know I'm not. And then Jesus appears to sort of belittle his host and her efforts to provide hospitality. This is how I heard this story. This is how I experienced this story. Be like Mary, don't be like Martha. Then it was pointed out to me how the author of Luke's gospel has a deep interest in telling stories that give examples of ministry and service with both men and women main characters. For example, before Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son, he begins with a pair of stories about things being lost and found. One story is about a male shepherd who has lost a sheep. The second story, the following story, has a woman who loses a silver coin. A male main character followed by a female main character. And at first it looks as if our story today only has two female main characters, right? Unless this story of these two sisters is actually a continuation of last week's gospel lesson. What if this story was meant to be told and heard together with the story before it with a male main character? All right, for 100 extra Jesus points, anybody able to recall what our story was last week? About being neighbors, Good Samaritan. Very good. I'll give you guys 50 each. Nice work. Let's collaborate. The Good Samaritan is one of Jesus' most famous parables, and I probably don't have to remind you of the details, but I'll sum it up. Last week we heard about a man who was a lawyer who wants to know what he has to do to inherit eternal life. Jesus says we're called to love the Lord our God and love our neighbor as ourselves. He then tells the story of the Good Samaritan to illustrate who is our neighbor. A Jewish guy gets beat up by robbers and left behind for dead. Two religious officials from his own country walk by and ignore him, but he is seen and he is helped by a Samaritan who otherwise would have been looked down on in the culture. All right? Who is the neighbor? Jesus asks. The male main character, the lawyer, responds, the one who showed mercy to the one in need. Jesus ends the story by saying, go and do likewise. Go and serve. Go and give. Go and help. Which appears to be exactly what Martha is doing, right? She has taken Jesus and his disciples into her home and is feeding them free of charge. So why then is Jesus kind of shaming this woman who's trying to live out his teaching to go and do likewise? Maybe it's important to look at the exact words Jesus uses when addressing Martha. So you're allowed to cheat. Looking at your gospel lesson, what does Jesus offer as critique? What's the precise thing that he that he critiques Mary about. Oh, Martha, yes, thank you. Eminem. Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. Worried and distracted. Suddenly, it sounds less like criticism to me, it sounds less like shame, and more like concern and care. Worried and distracted by many things. How many of us feel like Jesus could be speaking directly to you? How many of us feel pulled in so many different directions that you constantly are choosing who to disappoint, who to let down, or what event to miss out on this time? I want to tell you guys a story that still gets told. My grandfather has been dead for 25 years. My grandmother has been dead for about 5. But the story still gets told whenever the family gets together. So we always went up to my mom's parents' house for Thanksgiving. My grandparents' house was a tiny place, and yet they would fit all 14 of the siblings and the grandchildren and themselves around the dining room table. And my grandmother was a tiny woman too. She was a little one. And she and Grandpa would prepare this massive feast. All right, there would always be too much food, and everything would be on the table. But inevitably, a ritual would play out every time. All of us, all 13 of us, would be sitting down around the table. The food would be hot, ready to be eaten. We're ready to pray, and my grandmother would be missing. She'd be fussing with one more detail. And finally, my grandfather, every time, would call out, exasperated, "Damn it, Estelle! Sit down!" Every year. And every year, Grandma would finally stop. She would come and sit with us and eat and laugh and talk. These many years later, I realized that at first it sounded like he was being rude to my grandmother or being sharp with her. I realized that my grandfather wasn't doing this for himself. He wasn't doing this even for the rest of us who were hungry. He was calling out of concern for his wife. He didn't want her to miss out, to not be too worried or too distracted, to be present with her family and guests. And I wonder if presence, I wonder if attentiveness and care is part of what Jesus is trying to gift us with in the twin stories of the Good Samaritan and distracted Martha. I am struck continually by what causes the Good Samaritan to intervene and help the beaten man. Jesus says that the Samaritan came near and saw the man. How many of us have missed out on noticing someone in need because we didn't see them? How many of us have helped and served and cared for somebody but still failed to see those people that we were serving as a person or as a child of God, but instead seeing them just as a number or a label? Perhaps this is one of the messages that our gospel calls out to our worried and distracted world. Perhaps Jesus is telling us, be present, be here, where you are now. Be with and for our neighbors who are in need. Realize that there may be nothing more that they and you need than for you to sit down and listen and value them with your whole attention. Recently, we went to Washington, D.C. With our youth for our mission trip, and we had one of the hardest service activities that I've ever participated in. When our youth were in, it was early in the morning. We had to split into 2 groups, and most of our group went to a site where they were feeding breakfast to a ton of homeless people in need. And then there was another smaller group of us who went off to serve at a tiny Methodist church that was preparing to feed about 40 homeless men and women. So it was Haley, Hayden, and I. And we go in there and we're like, all right, what food do you need us to prepare? How do we run the coffee maker? All that kind of good stuff. And the organizer says, we got all that covered. He says, we need you guys to just go out there and sit and talk with the men and the women while they waited to eat. This was really, really hard. All right, I have 4 years of grad school, I have clinical training and hospital visits, and 10 years of ministry experience, and I was struggling to make conversation with these people because these folks were dealing with some real major issues. All right, we had people going through drug withdrawal, which is a scary, scary thing to see. We had people battling, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, which is a scary, scary thing to see and kind of follow. We had people that were opening up about domestic violence and other horrible things that they had experienced. Hayden and Haley were amazing. Because if you know them both, they were way out of their comfort zone. They didn't know what to say, and they didn't feel terribly comfortable talking to these people. But they stayed there. They were present. They weren't on their phones. They didn't pull themselves off away around a corner. Their presence affirmed the value and the worth of every person around those tables. They saw the people. They were with the people. In ending, I want to pick your brain a little bit. One of the things that I have learned as a pastor is that 95% of ministry is not prayer, is not scripture, is not theological knowledge. 95% of ministry is showing up, being present, listening to people, paying attention. Where you are, where are we, where is the church being called to slow down and see people who might be in need, to be present in the moment and at the meal, to be with our neighbors and to be with Christ. Who are the people around us that God is challenging us to notice, to serve, and to be present with in our communities, in our workplaces, and our homes? I need you to think about this. I need you guys to pray about this. I need you guys to reflect on this. And come talk to me. One of the cool things about summer is that I get a moment to breathe, and I get a moment to plan, and I'm starting to look at our whole next year. And there's been some really cool things where we have gotten to know people and gotten to work with people, gotten to be with people. We heard about it, Salvation Army. One of the things is that they said we need people to serve lunches down there. And not just serve them, we need people to be there and interact with folks. And let them know that they're important, that they are valuable. You guys are doing that. We saw that there was a need for vegetables and fruits in our neighborhoods, and so we started a garden. Where that's going to end up, we're not entirely sure, but we gave it a good run. The Wells program. We know that kids need opportunities to get outside, leadership development, job opportunities. You guys are doing that. We've hosted workshops now on drug and alcohol and mental illness. We now have one of the largest groups in our country, in our county, meeting in our church, providing hope and healing. What are we going to do next? Are we done? Where will we be called this next year? And I'm going to pitch you two things that we need that I need help with. One is God's work our hands. We do a kickoff every year, a community service event. Where would you like to serve? What projects are near and dear to your hearts? Where do we need to be God's hands in our neighborhood? The other question that I have, and somebody's been, I've been I always try to listen when I hear things multiple times. Recently, people have come to me and said, Pastor, I'd like to think about doing something with foster care. Either ministering to families who are considering being foster care families, ministering to the families, ministering to kids. Is that something that we are called to do? Is that something that we are in ministry to do? I don't know. At this point, I like to have a good ending to my sermons. I like kind of a wrap up and all that, but I'm not really sure what the ending is. And maybe that's appropriate for this story. Because at the end, what does Martha do? We don't know exactly, right? Does Martha, slam the pots on the floor and then, walk back into the kitchen? Does Martha laugh at herself and sit down? And then Mary and Martha and even Jesus help clean up everything when it's all over. The gospel is up to us. Jesus has put the gospel in the hands of the church. What will we do? Who will we serve? Thanks be to God. Amen.